Welcome to the Integral Stage. In our post-metaphysical and psychologizing time, how are we still to understand the role of spiritual teachers or sacred spaces in our own spiritual unfolding and illumination? We often read in integral or other contemporary literature about how teachers can serve important self-object functions for practitioners, or act as coaches and guides for navigating new and challenging phenomenological terrain, or as instructors for the twin tasks of growing up and waking up. Teachers can support our psychological, cultural, relational, and moral formation. But what about another more mysterious function of the student-teacher relationship, transmission? Is the notion of direct, energetic instruction something that still holds currency in our time? Not all spiritual lineages recognize its importance, but for those that are typically recognized as the speediest and most efficacious paths, transmission is often considered essential. Is the concept of transmission just a mythic holdover, better left behind? Or is it something that we should try to carry forward in contemporary spirituality? If it is real, how are we to understand it in our integral and post-metaphysical spiritual contexts? The title for this series of discussions, Fire from Heaven, is a poetic rendering of the Sanskrit term Shaktipat. Shakti means energy, and Pat means fall, the descent or the fall of energy, fire from heaven. Over the next several weeks, we hope to explore this topic in depth with a broad range of integral and mature spiritual practitioners. For this first episode, our host, Layman Pascal, will be joined by Mark Forman, well known in the integral community for his work as an integral psychotherapist, and also as one of the primary organizers of the Integral Theory Conferences in the United States. But Mark is also a longtime spiritual practitioner, and it is that side of him that we would like to engage today. To give a bit of his spiritual biography, Mark underwent a Kundalini awakening when he was 18 years old, and he has spent the past 25 years studying both Hindu yogic and Buddhist approaches to meditation. He has studied Kundalini Yoga under Guru Mai, Mindfulness with Melissa Blacker, Pragmatic Dharma with Kenneth Folk, and he most recently participated in Jeffrey Martin's Finder's Course. Mark identifies most strongly with the spiritual philosophy of non-dual Kashmir Shaivism. I hope you will join us over the next hour for an enriching mind walk into this question, as Layman and Mark reflect on the promise, peril, and pleasures of spiritual transmission.
Hey, Mark, good of you to join us. This is the first in our series of discussions on transmission and direct energy-like exchanges in spiritual and developmental contexts. I've got a list of questions, but I also kind of think about it in two main areas. Those two main areas for me are the mechanics. How does it work? What's going on? Is it all the same energy? Is it different energies? What helps it work? What hinders it working? And the other one is social and psychological, and what are the ethics of it? How do we relate to each other? What part of our society, what part of our spiritual practice does transmission fit into? Is it important? Is it unimportant? All those kind of things. So those are my two main big areas. Got these questions I've been thinking about, but what about you? Where do you stand on the topic in general? What intrigues you? What do you think of the problems and the opportunities? What's just sort of your first take on the issue?
I think, first of all, thank you for having me on and hosting. I've been looking forward to this. It's a little bit of a step out into some esoterics that I don't typically get to do in my day job. So this is a pleasure to be having this chat and covering some of these topics. I mean, I think the way that I would start to look at the topic, one sort of issue or track for me would be what people call the Kundalini experience. So just briefly, the movement of energy or a sense of energy, we can even put that in quotes, in the body, and how that corresponds to different perceptual and spiritual perceptual states. So that's a phenomena. And I see transmission largely related to the awakening of Kundalini or the empowerment of Kundalini energy in the body. And I'm quite aware that there are different traditions, particularly in the tantric traditions of what you might call Tantric Taoism, Tantric Buddhism, Tantric Hinduism, and possibly in the mystery schools of the West, although that seems less clear to me, that, people have different views on this topic of Kundalini, but I sort of get it pretty much from lineage, sort of consciousness in the Hindu tantric traditions, and that was where I started my practice and have stayed relatively rooted there, at least one aspect, even as I've explored other traditions. So Kundalini, and then the transmission of, where I would begin.
That's pretty classic. I think a lot of our thinking on the subject is framed out of the Hindu and Vedic traditions, particularly the yogic schools and things like that. I think a big part of that is their emphasis on the somatic experience, of how people sense energies moving in themselves. But let me ask you this: when it comes to Kundalini, when you're thinking of it as there's regions and then there's a channel.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like there's different transmissions from different energetic regions of the individuals?
Mm-hmm.
And is that different from an overall transmission of a central open channel of awakened energy?
That's a fascinating question, and I would answer that my experiences have felt like the transmission that I've received, or the sort of energy, or Shakti is the word that they would use, that I felt like I was being exposed to, was a whole body phenomena. In other words, it didn't seem to just localize to certain chakras. That doesn't mean that all my experiences were full body, just that no one ever said to me, now you're getting the transmission of your heart chakra,
right,
and then all of a sudden the energy was in my heart chakra. The practices that I were involved in were, you're going to be receiving the transmission of Shakti, but I would experience that as taking place throughout my body. Now, in my personal practice of meditation, which has been now about 25 years, that is not quite as true. I feel the energy or Shakti all over the body and all the way through the body, but it seems to move and localize and kind of have the directionality that people talk about, which is up towards the head and top of the head. So as I've practiced it, that has become more of a sort of potent center that I can feel and inhabit as I've gone along. So I would say it's both local and global, but I don't know if other lineages would transmit directly in some way. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. It's a mysterious topic.
Experiences that you've had that were as if receiving transmission, were they primarily in person with someone, or at a distance, or symbolic?
They were primarily in person and in places. So my two experiences are really that a particular group of people gathered has a transmission. If one of those persons is a teacher who is a transmitter, that amplifies the sense of it. And then I would say that and I don't have any way of explaining why this is, places, sacred places, seem to accumulate this feeling that at least I feel phenomenologically when I walk into a certain ashram or a meditation sitting room. It feels like the energy is thick in the air, is maybe one way I could try to describe it.
Yeah, and I know the experience very well. And
yeah.
I mean, I'd like your take on this, because it's hard initially to conceptualize what might be the same between an individual with their Kundalini awakened and a context and a sacred natural site and a particular architecture of a temple or building. What could they all possibly have in common that would enable some sort of consistent transmission experience?
Yeah. And it may be that, it's a susceptibility on the part of the practitioner that gives one that experience. So I've had both experiences in terms of bringing friends or who are sort of meditation naive into like a Shakti pot intensive environment and had them come along. And some of them have the full experience, meaning that they sense the energy, they have some of the classical experiences. Others don't seem to notice it that much, and it's not that impactful. So one thing I often wonder about is what makes one person notice that and another person not. I don't think it's entirely just subjective, because if you read around in the literature, certain teachers or certain places seem to just have more of these stories, and others don't. I mean, they have other stories, but so it doesn't seem like it's only down to the individual. It has something to do with the place or the person transmitting. But it is a fascinating question why or how a place could sort of almost metabolize the energy and hold it, and why that also happens sometimes in natural spots, or seems to.
I mean, I reach for words like configuration to try to say something that could be common among all these different transmission sources, but that doesn't tell us a lot. It just phrases it. And individually, it's really intriguing, like you say, what makes the difference for an individual. Part of that is how much transmission is coming towards them. But another part of it is, what are they willing to accept psychologically? What are they tuning into? Maybe, do they have a genetic predisposition toward being able to receive it? That's something I feel like has not been examined. Another thing would be, I don't know if you're familiar with Timothy Leary's notion of neural circuits, but he talked about the neurosomatic feedback circuit, where the body's experience is getting fed back to itself through the nervous system. That he associated with marijuana and with space travel and weightlessness and extreme sports, and a kind of mutation of people that he felt was happening in the 60s, a little more than it had previously happened to. Let people feel the excitement in the somatic body, which plays a big role in psychotherapy, it seems like, because some people who have that sensitivity to their own soma make progress a little differently in therapy than others do.
Yes.
So it seems to me like there might be a practiced capacity to sense excitement in the body, which disposes some people to receive or not receive transmission. How's that sound?
It sounds good. I think it connects to a lot of things. I'm remembering, Taoist stories where the teacher, tells the student, "Can you feel your liver?" And the student says, "No." And the teacher sort of says, "That's a problem, actually, that you can't." I mean, I'm probably paraphrasing and mangling the story a little bit, but you need to have the what we might call the proprioceptive ability. So perceptive is to feel from the outside, proprioceptive is to feel the self or feel the body inside. And so as you're doing those kinds of exercises, you can learn to develop a sense of energy in different parts of the body, and that it's actually the key practice in a certain way. If you're doing meditations that are developing the energy, the thing to do is to focus on the energy as the object of contemplation with detachment, so that you're not getting stuck in any particular, configuration, but your focused ability to feel the energy in your body tends to push this process forward. It allows it to unfold. And so I think that's a fascinating thing, particularly about energetics, is it's not only knowing, but it causes it to move forward. mantra meditation in a certain way is a way to distract your mind so that this energy can move more freely. Noting meditation is another that I've experienced that way. As I'm noting sensations and thoughts and feelings and body things, the energy moves because my verbal mind is occupied.
So what are those, in your impression, what are those mechanisms doing? What's the hindrance, right? Is it a situation where this energy always wants to flow and we're blocking it? Is it a situation where we just don't have access to enough, or some combination of the two?
My experience is that once awakened to a certain level, the energy wants to be engaged as much as can be tolerated by the body, mind, or the neural system. And at least for me, that has been a part of the contemplation and a part of the practice, is like, also, how much can I absorb? So I might go on a weekend and be receiving transmission, and I might also be just exhausted by the end. And of course, there's the classic book, Living with Kundalini by Gopi Krishna, who describes a spontaneous or a meditatively induced awakening of spiritual energy. That's very classic. But he also couldn't engage it very much because he would get very sick when he did. And he had to figure out a very specific diet and certain kinds of parameters for what his body mind could tolerate.
That's very interesting, because that touches on this notion of configuration we mentioned before, right?
Yeah.
If there's a particular arrangement of the insides of the transmitter, a particular arrangement of the natural setting, a particular arrangement of the temple layout, then there's also the problem that our insides are not disposed properly. The architecture is wrong, or it's not tidy enough, or something like that.
Yeah. Yes.
Or maybe we don't have the right nutrients. Like in Gopi Krishna's case, diet can mean a number of different things. And one of those things it might mean is you don't have the right minerals and electrolytes possibly to absorb it properly.
Yeah. For him, he found that he might have done more. It's been a while since I've read it, but he had to eat meat, he found, because the density of the meat would slow the energy down. And that's a little bit of the sort of lineage wisdom I picked up. When I would go on meditation retreats, they would have a lot of like heavy sweets that you could eat, which would, if you eat a brownie, it kind of like settles your energy downward, and that
grounding effect.
Yeah. And it's sort of a thing. I think Jack Kornfeld has a story of some kid who had a Kundalini awakening on a retreat, and they made him run laps and eat cheeseburgers. So there's the tuning of the mind and body. And I think over time, what happens is the body gets more acclimated, the energy flows more smoothly with less interruptions in the body mind, and the quality of the energy gets more subtle. So it starts out much more dense, and the sensation of the energy is kind of has like a little bit like a density of water to a certain extent, and then it sort of turns into steam. That's my experience, or more likely that's what happens over time.
Are you thinking of that in terms of a single practice session, or over the course of the development of your life, or both?
Probably over the long term. I don't know that I ever experienced a shift in that just in one session. I'm thinking of that as what's been like the longer term trajectory.
There's a kind of lore around, spontaneous Kriya movements and extraordinary experiences, that a lot of that happens up front. And then down the road, you sort of smoothed out. You either it doesn't happen as much, or you don't notice it as much, or it's just a subtler process.
Yes, I think it's that's probably a both and, in the sense that I think most people have spontaneous movements more towards the beginning of practice. However, there are certain spontaneous movements which seem to show up later in practice. So, for example, there's some spontaneous kind of movement and energy in the eyes, which is very different, like an intense squinting that happens just spontaneously, that I've read about and experienced later in my practice and wasn't there earlier in my practice. Early in my practice, full body movements were much more common. So I think there's an unfolding, and the energy still can get local in specific ways. It's not just a totally global kind of subtilizing effect. So yes, if that makes sense.
There was something you said a few questions ago, which put an interesting idea in my mind, or question, which is, we have a kind of cultural training now to be cautious about anthropomorphizing things.
Sure.
All right, we don't want to slip back into simplistic animism at any rate. But when you discussed the energy, you said that it wants to come as intensely as you'll allow it, right? So how do you feel about giving it intentionality? And do you feel like that's an important part of the practice? Because a lot of people personify it. It's the Shakti, it's the goddess, it's whatever, right? And that gives it a sense of agency. And does that move of attributing agency to it, even if it's only in our imagination, does that help the process along, to have it be like it's a relationship?
Yes. I would say in my experience, yes. So, I spent a while chanting. There's one hymn that I learned to the Kundalini in Sanskrit. And I do think that kind of practice, like a prayerful, intention setting attitude, almost an attitude that this force is kind of a spiritual other that we relate to. I think that can be incredibly helpful. Obviously, in this day and age, is that really true? Are there forces that are other than our perception, that we need to personify, or etc.? I don't know. I wouldn't push anybody in any direction. I would just say, in my experience, prayer, those kinds of things are helpful, if only to get me out of the way, if only to cause that feeling of surrender in me as the practitioner. And that's what I would say is the barometer. I would tell other people, if it makes you feel like it helps you surrender, then use the practice.
I don't always conceive of it that way, but I do sometimes. And I feel like my idea that it has intention, that it wants something, helps me to try to move myself around to get into the position I think it wants. Now, whether that's projected just from the fact that I'm built to think about life based on human relationships, or whether that's really how it is, those are philosophical niceties that may never get solved.
Yeah. And I often think about it, if I don't do it before practice, and I certainly don't always, sometimes during moments of real intensity in practice, if it feels like there's a very strong energy, or the energy is trying to break through a little bit, I do have a sort of part of my self that will respond with, like, this is what it wants. So don't judge, don't hold, just let the experience take you. And so there's a little bit of personification, or anthropomorphizing, if that's the right way to pronounce it. I always forget. So that sometimes is a really helpful reminder. It's just like, this is what it wants. And it may be a she, it may be an it, it may be a he, maybe none of the above. But it's a good practice reminder, I think,
Yeah.
for me in any case.
So let's talk a little bit about negativity of outcomes, right? We talked a little bit about Gopi Krishna and what he had to do in order to experience it in a more smoothly conductive and positive way for himself.
Mm-hmm.
But, one of the things that comes along with a little bit of conceiving it as a he, she, or an it with wants is maybe it has preferences. Maybe it wants different things at different times. Maybe it's like some people more than others. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it has a wrathful side. Maybe it has a harmful side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you feel about that? And what's, in your personal experience, what's the most negative outcome or the most negative case you've seen, if any?
I mean, reading back into some of the literature, and I spent a long time reading around for whatever was there. So there's a fellow named Lee Sanella, who is a medical doctor who wrote something called the Kundalini Experience. And he basically chronicled the different types of experiences. This probably has some touch points to Stan and Christina Groff's Spiritual Emergency. And the basic upshot was that there are certain people, not unlike psychedelics, who have sort of a bad trip on Kundalini, and they need a certain amount of support in order to stabilize a little bit.
Right.
So in other words, the experiences they have are too psychologically destabilizing, and it causes a lot of anxiety and sense of being a bit out of control. I think much like the psychedelic literature, when people are doing these things in a set and setting, the negative outcomes really are reduced pretty significantly. So I have never actually I only had one experience that I remember that was perceived as negative. This is a story, so this gets into transmission, and
Sure.
I can't tell how this happens, but I was doing a lot of meditation. This was my early 20s. I was in school and in my dorm, and I think I invited a kid, regular guy who's interested, to sit and meditate because I was in a little bit of a missionary phase. And whatever was happening with me, the way I guess I would say it is seemed like I was holding a lot of Shakti, because he, in the one session, started to have this very warm, prickly sensation through his neck and up through his head. And he told me later that it freaked him out. And I can't remember how much conversation we had, but he certainly was shocked. And I was surprised too, because I wasn't in any way intending for him to have that effect happen to him. Just seemed to happen. And then for mostly what I remember, he just didn't meditate again, and the experience didn't re-arise. So as far as I know, that was it. But that would be considered, I would call that like a little bit of a negative thing. If I had been able to go back in time, maybe I wouldn't have sat in that way a little bit too casually with people at that point, because I think I didn't know better, and was unschooled in a particular sense. But in being in big organizations and big sittings, it seems like most people metabolize what they need, and there's a certain feedback system that gets them to, they eat they bite off as much as they can chew eventually, and that the experiences are, in the overwhelming cases, positive. If there's a downside, it possibly that it makes you more sensitive to other people's energies and to energies of places and things. So it's almost like taking one of your senses and heightening it to the point of it actually can be sort of an irritant. I experience that less than I used to, but I do think I've cultivated a life that is more protective of my energy body than who I interact with and how than I might have. And I think that's a common enough story that you have.
Seems to me like there's a need for a comprehensive translineage body of wisdom on this topic, such as how do you handle those things? How do you handle the bad trip? Are there contraindications? When should you not do it? How do you metabolize it better? Things like that. And also, how do you make it work better in yourself?
Yes.
And so what do you think about that? When have you had moments where you think, this makes it work a lot better?
Oh yeah, totally. And some of it is like a face palm of like, I was told this 15 years ago and I didn't really get it. And so there's a there is wisdom out there. It seems to be located in more sort of like in a couple of lineages, and it hasn't really made the jump into the mindfulness movement. I mean, I've heard Shinzen Young talk about Kriyas a little bit, maybe a couple other folks, but a lot of people don't really pay it much attention. And it makes me wonder, are they just not having that experience? Because it does seem like certain people progress spiritually without this somatic, or without as much of a somatic sort of impact. And then sometimes it's hidden in the stories and it just doesn't get out in the teaching. So Andrew Cohen has his sort of enlightenment experiences in India, which I've heard him talk about, and they had this energetic quality. I'm not so sure how much he talked about that as a teacher, or at least certainly in his public discourses.
Right.
I've never heard it mentioned, maybe between him and his students. So I think, it's really this low-hanging fruit in the sense that somebody in this broad world of research and that is now happening in meditation and psychedelics and all of that should go back and look at this again and see if there's progress that can be made in tracking and cataloging these experiences, and possibly trying to see if there's anything that can be spotted biologically in a correlative sense, or correlative sense, in that, is there something, if people are experiencing the energy in their body, does that look different or the same as somebody who's just in a deep state of meditation, but not necessarily with an energetic component? It would shock me if there weren't a difference, because it's so noticeable as a physical sensation. It would shock me if there were not something going on in my brain to signal that, whatever, I'm experiencing intense energy in my forehead or something like that.
It'd be pretty nice to have the brain scan devices on hand so we can check as it happens.
It would be, but you'd have to screen for populations. I mean, it would be a really interesting thing. So, but I definitely concur that it would be a terrific thing if you could pick up like the big book of all the best research and really get a handle on, what this phenomena is about. What are the questions? What are the knowns and unknowns?
Individually, it's very hard to think of us making any progress without being really informed by one or more traditions. But I really want to know what it looks like if you examine for patterns without cross-referencing to those traditions. Just try to inspect the data for patterns.
Yep.
Right. So that's a huge project, but it'd be nice to encourage it to go forward somehow. Now, I'm interested in what you were saying about the people that experience it and don't experience it. Right. That's my observation as well. I'm shocked that people who are sitting for years in the same classes as myself were only thinking about what the teacher was saying and how they could apply that to their lives.
Mhm.
And I was barely paying attention to what he was saying because I thought the teaching was embodied in the direct transmission. Now, maybe one of us was wrong and one of us was right, or maybe it's two different styles for two different temperaments. I'm not
Mhm.
sure. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that popped up in my head as you were talking is, it's probably Vivekananda's division between, and I don't know how old this goes back, the four parts, but karma yoga, yana yoga, karma yoga, which is service yoga, essentially letting go of the fruits of your actions, jhana yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge or insight, bhakti yoga, which is devotional yoga, and then raja yoga, which is really the yoga of psychospiritual experience. And, of course, the idea is that on the path we might experience all four aspects, but that we have maybe a typological leaning. And so I've wondered if, for myself, because it's been my main experience, if I don't best fit in the Raja
Yeah.
category. Sometimes the Yana yoga just drives me nuts. Like I just get into the words, and I'm maybe a little better than I used to, but pointing out instructions in the knowledge way have never been as effective for me as practices that work with the energy, and I get my best perceptions, the deepest perceptions through those practices, as opposed to the talking through method. So yes, I wonder, just as you do, is it individual? I think it is to a degree. Some people just must be really wired for it, and sensitive to it. And I don't know what would distinguish that
Yeah.
person.
Now,
How would you be able to know beforehand so that you could put somebody in the right practice model or give them?
exactly. Yeah. What are the
Yeah,
traits? What are the contraindications for different approaches? And one
yeah,
of the things that occurred to me while you were speaking there was maybe there's a difference between capacity and sensitivity. You mentioned Andrew Cohen and the implication of the energetic phenomenon that might not be overt in his teaching presentation. Now,
mhm,
you might critique that and say, well, if it's there and the teacher's not addressing it, then that might be a deficit in the form of the teaching.
yeah,
But there may be this thing where it's happening and some of us are feeling it happen. And
yeah,
for other people, it's happening and they're not necessarily noting it, but it may be happening nonetheless, like their digestive processes.
yeah. I mean, in my family, my mother has a set of experiences which is almost identical to mine, or reverse it. Mine are almost identical to hers. She has the same receptivity, the same kind of long-term energetic process. My brother, who went to some of the same intensives, I don't think he had nearly that reaction. And why, I don't know. My uncle had some of the same exposure, and he didn't feel really anything, as far as I recall him recollecting. So just even in my family, I can see, where there's a deep similarity with one person and just a very divergent experience with others, and makes me wonder about the genetic parts. Yeah, and there's a difference between sensitivity and capacity. People might really feel it, but some people don't. I think some people don't want it, and sometimes even I don't want. Sometimes I would skip a session because I would just be like, I can't hold more of this. I am burned out.
Right.
I'm gonna go read the newspaper.
So, one way to construe that, a severe teacher would just describe that as a temporary failing on your part, right?
Uh-huh.
Not being dedicated enough. But is there a possibility of trauma when something is too much or too soon? Like with most of the things in our life, too much or too soon produces a traumatic response.
Yeah. Yeah, I, was very much given the attitude by my lineage that you should let this unfold in a natural way.
Right.
That was the word used. And what that meant to me was that, anybody experiencing this should pace themselves to the best of their ability. And don't try to push. Both because pushing gets you into over efforting. I mean, if you're sitting there just trying to hang on or trying to hold the energy in a particular way, you're probably not doing very effective practice because you're so contracted. So it doesn't help if you're truly burned out. And then, it's a little bit like back to the question of, is this an it or a she that we can relate to? It's sort of sensing that, your body has an intelligence in it, to it, that knows better than your mind. So your mind might say, I'm going to meditate for 12 hours straight and not move. But at some point, your body might say to you, it's not a wise idea, and you get up. And I think I trust that process very intrinsically now. I see it as so key to what my practice has been. And that was not any kind of wisdom I brought to it. It was a learning of trust the body, trust the energy, trust that sense that it's time to sit, and then trust that sense that it's time to back off, and give yourself that sort of space of not pushing it.
I agree with all that. I think that, the broad concept of natural or organic, or, working with the responsiveness and intelligence of the body to modulate aspects of it that might be too extreme for you, staying in contact with it, but not overloading yourself, making the maximum progress for yourself without, same as any other form of exercise. Anybody, no matter what shape they're in, can strain or injure themselves if they push it a little bit too far or do it when they're in the wrong shape.
Yep. I think it's a very good analogy. You want to, in general, start slow, warm yourself up, and then see where you are that day or that period in your training. And I've, really found that I meditated probably every day for about 7 years and had that sort of really daily practice. And then something shifted where it felt like I had to do it a bit more intuitively. And then I started doing intermittent, intensive practice. So I would take a couple of months, sometimes work with a new teacher or take a new practice, and then work and really try to intensify to the point of breakthrough.
Right.
And that's been really helpful for me. But it was a shift. For a while, it felt like if I didn't meditate, there was just this hunger, and it felt like the day was lost. And so it, in a sense, it was like the energy shifted. Now depth and intensity, when it's allowable, is preferable to just a little bit every day or whatever.
With different practices and different teachers and different meditation styles, have you found that to be a great variety of experiences, or is it roughly the same experience regardless of how you go into it?
It's been different experiences, but that common thread that they impact the energy is there for me. So, learning sort of basic mindfulness at a certain point, out of the sort of American Buddhist tradition, helped me relate to the energy in a slightly different way, a little more dispassionately, for example. And then I worked with a fellow named Kenneth Folk, who's a Buddhist teacher, but who has a really sophisticated model of the body's energy states. And with him, the practice was actually to just try to move deliberately through these energy states, which had this unfoldment towards the top of the head. And so it was a different experience, and it really was super helpful because the guidance I'd had before was a little more just sit and let it happen. And so to have a little more of a deliberate practice was very helpful. But that ultimately what it was doing for me was new ways to get in touch and allow the energy to unfold. So I see all practices as related to it, but maybe not for everybody, is how I would put it.
Yeah, one of the ways I try to think about it is an imagination exercise, thinking about what the primitive human experience was.
Yes.
Before there was language, before there were any fleshed out traditions, what were the proto-humans doing?
Yeah.
Right? They would have had the basic types. They would have had the genetics. They had the experience. They could detect the sacred spots. How did they go at it in just a really basic and primal way that would be useful and maybe underlies and can even evaluate all the traditions we have today?
Yeah. Do you want to geek out here for a minute?
What do you got?
So have you ever read J. Nigro Sansonese?
I have not.
Okay, yeah. Totally weird guy, writes this incredibly esoteric, impressive and strange book, probably in the late 80s. And his basic argument was that all of mythology were coded instructions for how to work with the body in meditation. So so the underworld, if you can imagine, is anything from here down. It's the sea or the underworld of feelings and emotions, and it's dark and murky. And then the sort of the level of kind of the earth plane, where we all hang out, is sort of the realm of the senses, and it's the energies, but lower in the head area and things we experience in that way, in typical conventional consciousness. And then the heaven realms are representing the top of the head, or the energy centers in the head, and that there are these moments in the energetic practice where the energy breaks through from below to above. And so he just said that he believed like a simple, like thinking of like a simple hunter-gatherer 40,000 years ago is tracking game. And what he notices is that when he stops to slow down to track the game in almost, complete silence, his breathing changes. And then as his breathing changes, his state of consciousness changes. So Sansonese argued that essentially that could have been the genesis of some of these very early yogic practices, which, our best guess is they obviously informed the tantric view, which is a very, very old view in spoken form, in the spoken lineage. It's old. It goes way back there. So, and then the miraculous piece is just somehow our body has the capacity to do this, which I find one of the more miraculous, just that our body has this potential. And isn't that incredibly strange that we would seem to come with an aspect of our nervous system that can be unlocked towards deeper consciousness. And it's yet so available and so strange.
It's beautiful and peculiar, but it seems to be built right into the system.
Yep.
That model you're talking about, I mean, I resonate with it very much. And I think, our ancestors had an enormous amount of experience of their bodies, very intense. and they did not have an enormous amount of information about ancient history and the actual universe, right? Their cosmological models are much more likely to have been biopsychological models than actual theories about the cosmos. We see that in a lot of the ancient imagery, the grand man and all, the shamanic mandala and things like that. So I really, that's an exciting way to approach it, to try to decode the wisdom of the ancestors through the hints found in the mythological universe.
Yeah. And he would say, Sansonese would say, all this, I mean, I love myth as meaning making, but he would say that that's really like a latter day concern for us moderners. We like meaning making and we like the stories that way, but that thousands and thousands of years ago, myths were probably more like riddles that got revealed in, initiation rites that, all tribes had. And Campbell talks about it this way as well, sort of the revelation of the meaning of the myths. And he even has a line that he talks about the myths representing the energies of the body, but Campbell never expanded on the line. He just sort of said it, and that was that.
My mother, we weren't really a Christian household, but we had a Bible. We were sort of generally part of Christendom. And one of the things I really liked from my mother's attitude was that her take on the gospel was sort of a yogic technology manual. And when you read it like that, you can easily read the parables as if there's sort of general socio-moral lessons that might be at the end of a Disney movie. But you can also read them as instructions to his intimates of very particular things that can be done. There's a lot of strange phrasing in there, making the eye one and switching. So it may be even up until very recently, that esoteric sects continued to operate in this manner of instruction through coded psychophysical instructions. I think we should, we would be remiss if we didn't touch on what might be the ethical question, or how we distinguish a good transmitter from a good person. Because obviously that's probably what a lot of people are concerned about is, what does it mean that someone is a powerful transmitter and a useful transmitter? And how do we approach that? And what should we assume about them? And what should we not assume about them based on this capacity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, on one hand, I don't know where the transmission centers really are in the culture now. Like, where does one go? Who has that reputation? So that's interesting. I think in part because there may be more ethical problems that arise in these kind of traditions because they're so visceral, and that visceral experience is so compelling. So I do think there's a difference between a great transmitter and a great person. It reminds me of that line, the best thing about the artist is their art. And I sometimes think the best thing about a transmitter is their transmission, and doesn't necessarily mean that the person can't also be a good teacher in other ways. I think there are a host of issues in pedagogy that, people are either effective at helping people once they've transmitted, they're either effective at, guiding people through, or they're less effective. And sometimes the less effective happens in, these big ethical breaches. So I don't know if you have ideas. I just wonder how you do both. Like, because the energy is a little wild, by nature. I sometimes wonder whether it really only works in small communities. That's sometimes the impression I think about. Like, this is really meant for like a teacher and a inner circle of students. This is not meant for mass consumption, or doesn't do well because you don't have the containment that you might have.
If it's ancient, then probably it's adapted to very small communities, because that's what there was for the lion's share of history.
Yeah.
You know, how we make use of that in a global context is a little bit uncertain, whether it still has to just be in those little pockets or whether there's a form of it applicable to the mass. And it is very tricky, because you can say, on the one hand, because it's so slippery, it's a bit like sexuality, where it's going to dance across borders almost by its very nature.
Yeah.
However, so then you say, well, what would our general translineage wisdom on the subject be? You'd hope people have enough self-cognizance and self-esteem and an awareness of what it is that they are there for and what their own boundaries are. That would be ideal. But that's obviously not going to characterize most of the people in most of the situations.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're touching in on, the big ethical questions that are happening in general with the whole concept of a spiritual teacher. I would say once you add sort of a transmission factor, it just magnifies those questions, because now you're having this, intense bodily experience, which seems to localize itself in your teacher. And although it's funny, your teacher doesn't have to be there, it seems to me. So there's spaces and places can still matter, but the person, it matters. That transmitter matters. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm afraid that my attitude is a little bit like, look, life is messy, so go in and get this if you really want it, and try to keep your head up for entanglements and power plays, and that was my attitude. I went to events and I went to meditation retreats, and I didn't get too entangled with people or the inner circle or any of that. I felt like I was there to get, the transmission, and the transmission was the teaching, even though there were good other teachings, but it all boiled down to like this. But, is there a safe way to onboard people with the transmitter in the center? Maybe, having that board of directors approach where there's people the teacher has to be accountable to, who are sort of the watchers. That may be a model that, is helpful. I even heard Andrew Cohen say something, which I was surprised to hear him say, but he said, he reflected on what's wrong with the guru model. And one of them is sort of like the idea that the guru is perfect as a person kind of needs to hit the road, because that just isn't true. So we take away that part. And then also he says, the student should never give over their power to the teacher, never submit themselves in the sense of, I'm going to allow you.
That's a very interesting point, because I think that requires a special skill on the part of the student, which is something like tactical surrender. Because yes, you have to be there for your own reason. You have to think, I'm here to get this. I'm not here to be subservient to a person and their games necessarily. But if there's an element of receiving it that requires my surrender, how do I do that in a way that doesn't get mixed up with just turning myself over to whatever's going on in another human being?
Yes. So in that sense, having an internal guard, and, in integral lingo, probably something like having some orange is very helpful, so having that self-authoring capacity where authority gets located a little more in the self may be helpful. And then I love that concept of tactical surrender. I think, that rings true, or at least it rings true for the times. I mean, there might be something to full surrender, which brings something to the process that you can't get another way. But I don't know that to be the case. I wonder sometimes, is the old way the best way, but is also the old way feasible for most people? So, that utilitarian question, how do you bring the most benefit to the most persons? It seems more to me the attractive question, especially as society gets more and more interested in meditation and spiritual experience.
It doesn't seem like there's any way to devise a perfect handbook on the subject, but we could go a lot farther in that direction than we have hitherto gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people could have a better idea of how they should comport themselves to make use of a phenomenon, and how they should comport themselves to provide a phenomenon. And like you say, a board of directors is one model. Now, there might be people who are specifically attuned to a wilder, more free-range experience.
Yeah.
Right? They should be allowed to do that, but they should be allowed to do it in the context of a more informed system where everybody kind of knows what the risks are.
Yeah. I really think if I have sort of the focus of the smart people who are doing all this research in these domains, I would say this is the most interesting phenomena that nobody has really tackled from a fully sort of objective scientific perspective, and that there's a gap there. So it's not to say the lineages don't have wisdom, but it's always interesting to go back over with that modern lens, like what is happening, what can we say, how can we categorize? And I just it may be 1 degree too spooky for the people even on the leading edge. It makes me think of a fellow like Sam Harris, who's teaching a lot of meditation. How much has he experienced this? If he did experience this, would he even talk about it?
Exactly. And I think my guess is a lot of people who are on the leading edge culturally and cognitively and are pursuing these developmental practices have had these experiences and are a little bit reticent about getting into the conversation. They're not hearing a conversation on these topics that makes them feel safe enough to add in their own experiences and guesses. So that's what we're hoping to, start or encourage a little bit, because it seems to me it's very pertinent. Like coming back to the body, coming back to the ecology and the mechanics is a place where Dharma and science can come together, but it's also a way. It seems like there's an overall movement in that direction to get away a little bit from the abstracted form of spirituality that was very prevalent among our ancestors, right? There's a tendency to talk about mindfulness or pure consciousness or things like this, and those things are fantastic, handled in the right way, but they can be disempowering, they can be disembodied, they can run up against health, against individual well-being, against the kind of ethics we need to really live on a planet with bodies, with ecosystems. How you handle that, a manifest cosmos.
Yes. And I would say if there's anything that seems like a miracle to me, the idea that for whatever reason one person can transmit this to another person and have lasting effects or immediate effects is the most miraculous thing I am comfortable saying exists in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I've never been abducted by a UFO. I've never had a out-of-body experience or a near-death experience. So there are other miracles that, may qualify. For me, this has been the most miraculous thing. And I would love to know the answer of how this works and how it's done. And I suspect thousands of years in the future, maybe we'll know. But
That's a cautious but beautiful sentiment. It might make a good place to kind of end on. And if
okay.
Bruce is out there somewhere, maybe he wants to jump in and add a final comment, unless he's busy face deep in papers that need to be graded.
Hi, I actually have been grading, and I've listened to the entire thing, so I don't know what I've written on their papers. And we also were playing with fire a little bit, inviting some fiery energy into our exchange, because I heard all kinds of little crackles and lightning strikes in coming through the audio here.
You think, yeah, can it affect the electronics?
Yeah. Actually, I thought it was a wonderful conversation, and I really just felt kind of a growing excitement through it, thinking that this is a conversation that I've kind of wanted to hear and haven't heard that much broached yet. So I'm glad to kind of hear you touching on that at the end, that this is a place that maybe there's not adequate invitation or container for this kind of exchange. And so, yeah, it's nice.
I feel like we could talk about it a lot more.
Yeah.
This is the first one in the series, so I want to thank you, Mark, for like being here and helping us. Like, this one will really help us flesh out what the next ones are, how to approach those.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real help to us.
This was a total fun for me, and I really thank you guys for the invitation. I think the other one was on the nature of evil, and I was it just felt heavy at the moment, and this one felt light and my curiosity is totally up for it, so appreciate it. This was great.
Sure. Yeah, I had a lot of fun.